The snow had been falling over the Gallatin Valley for 6 hours by the time Ethan Cross turned his truck onto the county road at 3:30, and the world outside had gone completely white. He hadn't planned to come back. Hadn't planned much of anything since the call 3 weeks ago that told him his mother was gone. In the passenger seat, Ghost lifted his head. Then he stood, which he never did while the truck was still moving. Through the frosted windshield, past the dark ridge of his mother's property line, a thin column of smoke was rising from the farmhouse chimney, the one that should have been cold since November. What that Marine and his K9 were about to find at the end of that snow-covered road would expose a secret his mother had carried to her grave, a promise made in the dark of her final days, and the name of a fallen soldier that Ethan Cross had never known she was carrying alongside his own. If you're new here, stay with this one. This channel tells stories exactly like this one, and you'll want to be here when the truth comes out. Ethan Cross was 34 years old and had been places that don't appear on the maps his mother kept folded in the kitchen drawer. He joined the Marines at 18 because the recruiter who came to Bozeman Senior High had looked at him the way nobody else had since his father left when he was 9, like there was something worth developing. He'd signed the papers in March and shipped out before the school year ended. 2 tours in Afghanistan. 1 rotation that never made it into the paperwork he was allowed to keep. He came back from the 3rd deployment with all his limbs and a quiet that his mother had noticed but not named, because she understood that naming it would make it permanent and she wanted it to heal. She had stood on the porch when he came home that last time, both hands tucked into her apron pockets, and looked at him for a moment before she said anything. "You look thin. Come inside." That was her version of "I love you, and I'm glad you're still here." He'd heard it right. He'd been posted in San Diego when the first call came about her health. Emergency leave denied. 4 months later, he'd gotten 2 weeks. Long enough to see that the farmhouse needed a new furnace, and his mother was smaller than she used to be, not long enough to understand why. The second call came while he was in the air. She'd been gone for 14 hours by the time he landed in Billings. He hadn't gone back after the burial. 8 months of nowhere in particular, a security contract at a logistics port, 4 hours of sleep when he could manage it, a cracked asphalt parking lot that pretended to be a yard for Ghost. Ghost was a Belgian Malinois, 73 pounds, with a coat the color of dark sand and one ear that had never quite decided to stand at full attention. He'd been Ethan's service partner through the last deployment, and had come home with him in the way that suggested the dog had simply made a decision, and the Marine had agreed with it. At night, in the bad hours, Ghost would cross to wherever Ethan was sitting and place one paw on his knee. Not both. Just one. Like he was checking something. He waited until whatever he was checking came back right before he lay back down. He hadn't been planning to go back to the farm at all. And then one morning at 4 a.m. In that parking lot, Ghost had put both paws on his knee. So, he went. Walter Pruitt was 84 years old and had been the principal of Eastwood High School in Spokane, Washington for 31 years. He had retired at 68, buried his wife at 72, and raised 1 son in the years between, a boy named James, who had joined the Army at 19 and become a soldier the way some men become exactly what they were built to be. James deployed to Afghanistan in 2010 and died there in 2011, in Helmand Province, 22 years old. The Army sent a flag and a letter and 2 men in dress uniforms, and Walter had stood at his front door and received those things with the steadiness of a man who had already accepted the news before it arrived. He still set 2 places at the table every morning. He had done it every day for 12 years. He did it here too. 1 plate for himself, 1 for whatever deserved to be present, a memory, the particular quality of winter light, a name said quietly before the coffee finished brewing. He had never described this to anyone. Some practices don't require an audience to be real. He had moved to Montana at 81 to be near his daughter, who had married a man in Bozeman. He had sold his Spokane house at a loss to help with their down payment. He'd moved into their guest room with a single bag and the quiet intention of being useful wherever useful was possible. Dennis had other intentions. He had not said so plainly. Men of his type rarely do. He'd set it sideways, through small rearrangements, in the temperature of rooms, in the way Walter's meals began arriving later and later, in the way his name disappeared from household conversations, replaced first by him, and eventually by silence. Walter's daughter was not cruel. She was afraid, and wore herself thin between the two of them, and Walter understood this and did not blame her for it. He stayed longer than he should have because leaving felt like abandonment, and he had had enough of that already. He had lasted 18 months before he heard about the farmhouse through the Methodist Women's Group, where he had been volunteering on Thursday mornings, partly to be useful, partly to have somewhere to be that wasn't a room where he felt like a problem that hadn't yet been solved. A woman named Margaret Cross had mentioned, in the careful indirect way of someone offering more than she was saying out loud, that her farm on the county road sat empty most of the year, and she worried about the pipes in winter. Walter had mentioned, in the same careful register, that he was living somewhere difficult. 2 Thursdays later, Margaret had pressed a key into his hand without conditions or explanation, just the steady certainty of a woman who had made a decision and wasn't going to revisit it. He had come to understand, in the months that followed, that there had been more to the offering than warmth. The smoke coming from Ethan's windshield was rising from the living room chimney, not the kitchen one. His mother had only lit that fireplace in winter. She had only lit it when she had company. Ghost was out of the truck before Ethan had fully stopped it. That alone was wrong. He never exited without the release word. Ethan had not given it. The dog dropped his nose to the snow and moved directly toward the farmhouse door without looking back. Ethan followed. The door wasn't locked. It had never had a working lock, not since the handle stripped in 2018, and his mother had declared that a feature rather than a problem. When he pushed it open, the warmth of the house came out in a rush that smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and something else he couldn't name for a moment, and then did. Bread. The smell of his mother's bread. In a house where his mother had been dead for 8 months. The man sitting at the kitchen table was old and broad-shouldered and very still. He did not flinch when the door opened. White hair, cut close. Hands around a coffee mug, large hands, scarred across the knuckles, in the way of a man who had worked physically for most of his life. He looked at Ethan the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for long enough that he is not entirely certain whether it is good news or just the end of waiting. "I figured you'd come eventually," he said. "Your mother said you would." Ethan said, "Who are you?" Walter Pruitt. He didn't stand, but he offered the name with the quiet dignity of a man who had once stood for things and hadn't forgotten what that felt like. "I've been here since July." Ghost had crossed the kitchen floor without command and sat beside the old man's chair. He didn't put his head on Walter's knee. He just sat, straight and attentive, in the posture he used when he had made a decision about a person, and the decision was good. Ethan looked at the room. It was clean in the way that required daily effort. Dishes done, floor swept. The counter clear of everything except a loaf of bread cooling on the rack his mother had kept in the same spot for 30 years. On the table beside Walter's mug was a small framed photograph. Ethan knew the photograph before his eyes fully processed it, because he had grown up with it. His mother, young, standing in front of the barn in a summer he'd never witnessed. He hadn't known a copy of it existed outside the one on the living room shelf. "She gave it to me," Walter said, seeing him look. "So I wouldn't forget what I was keeping the place for." Ethan sat down across from a stranger in his dead mother's kitchen and said, "Start from the beginning." Walter started from the beginning. He talked about Spokane, about James. He said his son's name without ceremony, the way a man speaks the name of someone he has carried long enough that it has become structural, part of how he holds himself upright. James had been 22 when he died in Helmand Province. Walter had received the news with the steadiness of a man who had already known it was coming, though he could not have explained how, and had stood in his own hallway for a long time after he closed the door behind the two soldiers in dress uniforms. Ethan said nothing. Ghost had not moved from beside the old man's chair. Have you ever known someone like Walter? Someone who lost the most important thing and kept showing up anyway, to the school, to the Thursday group, to the guest room of a daughter who needed more than he was being given credit for? If that kind of person is still in your life, call them after this. If they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. Walter talked about Bozeman, about Dennis. He told it plainly, without self-pity, with the editorial efficiency of a man who had organized the story carefully so it took up exactly the right amount of space, enough to be understood, not so much that it became a burden someone else had to manage. He described the guest room, the meals, the silence that began slowly and then got faster. He described his daughter, who was not cruel and was afraid, and whom he missed with a specific and ongoing grief that he did not name directly, but that was present in the way he paused at certain moments. Then, he told Ethan about the Thursdays, about Margaret. She knew about James, Walter said. She'd looked him up after we met. She found the unit and the date and the province. She found the name of the man who led his platoon. He paused. She told me, the week before she died, that your unit had operated in Helmand in 2011. She said she'd known about James since October. Ethan was still. She said she'd always worried you would come home to nothing, Walter continued. She said the farm was the one thing she had made sure stayed clean. No debt, no encumbrance, something solid. She wanted someone here when you came back. He looked at the table for a moment. She asked me to stay until you did. She made me promise someone would be here. She died in November. Walter stayed. What Walter said next would change everything Ethan thought he understood about the months he'd been in San Diego, telling himself there was nothing left to come back to. Walter set down his mug and folded his hands on the table. A man came here last week. Said he was from a company called Meridian Property Partners. He had papers. He said your mother had entered into a reverse mortgage arrangement before she died, and if the estate wasn't settled by the end of this month, Meridian would file for reversion of the property. He said the company name carefully, like something he had memorized specifically so he wouldn't misstate it. He said he'd be back Friday. Ethan said, "She never mentioned a reverse mortgage." I know. She told me the week before she died that the farm was the one thing she had kept entirely clean. She used that word, clean. A pause. She also told me that a man from a company had come to the house in September when she was already ill. He had papers for her to sign. She sent him away. She told me she'd sent him away and that she thought it was done. Ethan looked at him. Did she tell you the company's name? Walter nodded once. Today was Wednesday. Ghost went to the back hallway before Ethan asked him to. The dog moved without command to the door of the small guest bedroom, the one with the sloped ceiling that Ethan had slept in as a child on nights when the upstairs floors were being refinished. The door was slightly ajar. Ghost stood at the threshold and looked back once, in the way that meant, here. Ethan pushed it open. The room was tidy in the way Walter was tidy, organized as a matter of discipline. Bed made to a specific standard. Clothes folded. One pair of boots aligned near the baseboard. On the right side of the bed, at the exact height a hand might reach from the pillow in the middle of the night, a small section of wallpaper had been pulled back at the corner. Behind it, in writing Ethan recognized before his eyes fully processed it, were 2 lines in faded ballpoint. Call Ethan. Tell him what they tried. He needs to know. His mother's handwriting. She had put it there where it couldn't be stumbled upon, where only someone sleeping in that room, in the dark, reaching for something and finding the wall instead, would ever find it. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not go back to the kitchen immediately. He stood in the hallway and let the information arrange itself into something he could carry. Not grief. Not yet. Something more specific. The understanding of what she had been doing in the months he wasn't there. Building something. Protecting something. Keeping the place warm for when he came back. Right up until she had run out of time. He went back to the kitchen. If you were in Ethan's position right now, having seen exactly what he had seen, would you have stayed? Type yes or no in the comments. I read every one. He spent that evening on the phone with Frank Devers in Billings, who listened to the description of the Meridian document with a silence that told Ethan everything before Frank spoke. There were no liens. There was no reverse mortgage. Frank had handled the estate documentation personally and would have known. He had never heard of Meridian Property Partners. The signature was either a forgery or something extracted from a dying woman under false pretenses. And given the September visit, Frank had a firm working theory about which. Keep him there, Frank said. Don't let anyone sign anything. Ethan said, I wasn't planning to. He cooked that night from Walter's provisions. He and Walter ate together at the kitchen table without discussing what was coming. The way 2 men accustomed to waiting occupy the hours before something they've already decided to meet. Ghost settled at the foot of the table between both chairs, comfortable in the way he only got comfortable when the situation had been fully assessed. Cameron Hale came Thursday instead of Friday. He arrived at 9 in the morning in a dark sedan, a second car behind him. The man who stepped out first was younger than Ethan had expected, early 40s, a face that had been good-looking long enough to rely on it. He wore a coat that cost more than most people's monthly expenses and carried a folder under his arm with the ease of someone accustomed to folders doing the work for him. His colleague in a gray jacket trailed 1 step behind. They walked toward the farmhouse door the way people walk toward things they believe they already own. Ethan opened it before the knock. Hale looked at Ethan and made a quick professional recalibration, a small tightening around the eyes, a shift in posture. He'd encountered obstacles before. He had different approaches for them. Mr. Cross, he said. I'm glad you're here. I was hoping to speak with you directly. His gaze moved past Ethan to Ghost, standing in the doorway, and stopped. Ghost was not barking. Ghost had not moved, but a sound was coming from somewhere low in his chest. Not exactly a growl, something lower and more continuous than that, a frequency that registered in the chest before the ears fully caught it. His head was level, ears slightly forward, eyes fixed on Hale with the attention of something that had already made a decision and was waiting to see whether the decision needed to be acted on. Come in, Ethan said. He said it without inflection. Hale came in. His colleague followed. They were 3 steps into the kitchen when they saw Walter. He was sitting at the table in the same chair he'd occupied every morning for 8 months, both hands around his mug, watching Hale with the steadiness of a man who has been told something important and has been sitting with it long enough that he is no longer afraid of it. He did not stand. He did not look away. Ghost crossed the kitchen in 2 steps without being told and positioned himself between Hale and Walter's chair. He did not bark. He stood with his body turned slightly sideways, the low continuous sound in his chest unchanged. Eyes on Hale with the fixed attention of something that has placed itself where it intends to remain. Hale stopped. He looked at the dog. He looked at Ethan. He placed his folder on the table with the careful confidence of a man who has learned that the folder is usually enough. "The documentation is quite straightforward," he said. "Your mother entered into a reverse mortgage arrangement in September of last year. Given the estate timeline, Meridian has a legal interest in. She sent you away in September," Ethan said. The professional confidence shifted. Barely. But Ethan had spent years learning to read the small adjustments men made when something they expected to work didn't work. "Mr. Cross, I understand this is difficult. She sent you away. You came back after she died with a forged signature on documentation designed to establish a fraudulent lien before the estate could be settled." Ethan's voice was even and unhurried. "The county recorder's office has the original deed. My mother's attorney has been in contact with them since yesterday afternoon. The estate has no encumbrances of any kind." Hale looked at his colleague. Then, very deliberately, he looked at Walter. "The gentleman occupying this property without legal authorization." Walter looked up at Hale with the steadiness of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has chosen this moment to put it down. She said they'd already tried once. 6 words, not performed. They came out the way truth comes out of old men who've carried it alone through a long winter. Quiet and exact. Spoken in front of witnesses in a room that still held the warmth of the woman who'd asked him to stay and protect what was here. The room went still. Ghost did not move. Hale heard it. His colleague heard it. Everyone in that kitchen heard it. The folder on the table meant something different now. Hale's gaze moved from Walter to Ghost, who had not shifted position by a single inch, whose eyes had not left Hale's face, whose body remained exactly between the old man's chair and anywhere Hale might think to step. The sound in the dog's chest was unchanged, patient and total, and entirely without urgency, because urgency would only be required if Hale made a decision the dog had already decided he would not be allowed to make. Hale did not make that decision. Ethan picked up the folder from the table. "Frank Devers in Billings is expecting the original documentation from your company by end of business today. He's also filing a complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding fraudulent lien attempts on estate property." He set the folder back down in front of Hale. "I'd like you to leave my mother's house." The colleague was already at the door. Hale stood for a moment longer. He picked up the folder. He looked once more at Ghost, who looked back without blinking, without moving, without altering the low continuous note in his chest. Then he left. Ghost tracked the sound of both cars until the road outside had been silent for 2 full minutes. Then he walked back to Walter's chair, sat down, and the sound stopped. But the deeper truth, the one that had been running through the entire story without a name, had not yet been spoken out loud. The State Attorney General's investigation, opened the following week, identified 9 fraudulent lien attempts by Meridian Property Partners over 26 months. All of them targeting rural estates in transition. All in the window where an heir was out of contact and a forged document could move faster than anyone thought to check. 3 families had already lost property. Cameron Hale and 2 colleagues were named in the complaint. The investigation was ongoing by year's end. What happened on the Gallatin Valley property happened quietly, the way things happen when they don't need to be performed. The women from the Thursday group came Saturday morning, 6 of them, with food enough for a week, in the efficient way of people who understand that presence is its own kind of provision. A small woman named Ruth Calloway, Margaret Cross's closest Thursday friend, walked in without preamble, sat down beside Walter, and put her hand over his. Walter turned slightly away. When he turned back, neither of them addressed it. The room understood. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like arrangement. Ethan stood at the kitchen window and thought about his mother pressing a key into an old man's hand, hiding a message behind wallpaper because she knew, at the end, that her son would come home. Not because she could guarantee it. Because she knew who he was. He had been in San Diego for 8 months telling himself there was nothing left to come back to. She had been here the whole time, building something for him to find. He went back to the kitchen. Ghost was asleep on the kitchen floor between Walter's chair and Ruth's, in the heavy way he only slept when everything had been assessed and found safe. Ethan sat down and accepted the plate that was set in front of him, and for the first time in 8 months, he ate a meal that tasted like something he recognized. Walter looked at him across the table. "She talked about you every Thursday," he said. "Every single one." Ethan looked at his plate. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wasn't here enough." "You were here," Walter said simply, with the specificity of a man who meant it literally and not as comfort. "She said so. She said you were here every day, just at a distance. She said that was the job, and she understood the job." He picked up his coffee and held it in both hands. She understood it better than most people do. Some debts can't be paid backward, only forward, to the next person you find who needs someone to see the smoke from the road and not keep driving. The farm needed a new roof. The furnace would need replacement before February. 12 acres hadn't been properly tended in the better part of a year. There was a guest room with a message behind the wallpaper that Ethan would leave exactly where it was for as long as he owned the place. He stayed. It was not an extraordinary thing to do in the way we usually mean that word. He had the same 24 hours as anyone else. He simply chose not to drive past the smoke. This story is for every person keeping a promise no one asked them to keep out loud, and for anyone who has ever pressed a key into a stranger's hand because they could see something that needed protecting. If this story brought someone to mind, a parent, a neighbor, someone you've been meaning to check on, someone who set the table for too long after they had any reason to, tell me their name in the comments. I read every one. Let's fill this section with people who deserve to be remembered. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here when the next one is told. There are more stories. Which moment in this story stayed with you the longest? I'll see you in the comments.